This time we'll look at 5 classic mopeds you might never have heard of. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Now, the moped was originally intended to bridge that halfway between a bicycle and a motorcycle, hence 50cc engine and pedals, and essentially it filled in the gap that had been left behind by the autocycles of the early 1950s. Various companies in Japan and Europe produced these little bikes during the early and mid-70s. However, the UK government felt these bikes were getting just too sporty. So in '77 they changed the regulations, deleted the pedals which they felt were pretty much useless, and restricted the bikes down to 30 miles an hour. So while it's obvious that some of the bikes shown here don't actually have pedals, they are in fact in the eyes of the UK law, mopeds. So with that in mind, here's 5 classic mopeds you might never have heard of. Flandria. As the name suggests, Flandria is a cycle company based in Flanders in Belgium. Between 1957 and 1979, the company in fact did run its own professional cycling team, which was reasonably successful. As a sideline, they also produced lawnmowers and mopeds, and was in fact one of Belgium's largest producers of mopeds and small motorcycles. And that was quite a large market during the 1960s and 70s. Moped production had started in 1950, and in that first year alone, they sold 25,000 units, and for a time they even sold their mopeds in the United States under the Bermuda name. However, even with these international sales, the company was struggling during the 1970s. The Japanese were simply able to offer a more advanced, more technically sophisticated machine for less money, and Flandria would finish moped production in 1979. The record was perhaps Flandria's most sporting and glamorous model. And in truth it did use an engine pretty much the same as the rest of the range, but at least it did boast a 4 or a 5-speed gearbox, depending on model. There's no doubt the machine boasted rather funky styling, with its streamlined bikini fairing, narrow tank and groovy clip-on handlebars. It really did look every inch the calf racer. But while the chassis components were pretty good, the engine simply couldn't hold a candle to the Japanese opposition. It couldn't live with an FS1E in a straight line. And unfortunately, nor could it compete in terms of cost. In terms of cost on the modern classic motorcycle market, the Flandria is a much cheaper buy than say an FS1E, prices of which have of course skyrocketed in recent years. That is of course if you can find one. Surviving Flandrias are few and far between, most were just ridden into the ground and thrown away back in the 70s and 80s. So if you can find a good one, you'll be doing very well indeed. Paloma. Paloma is a little-known French moped producer that was based near the Seine. If you try and Google them, you'll just end up with endless images of Paloma Faith riding a moped or something. Now, I've got nothing against Paloma Faith, she's got a lovely voice, but if you're trying to do research on a motorcycle, it's really not helpful. And unfortunately, while there is lots of information out about Paloma Faith, for her namesake, the French motorcycle company, there's rather less information out there. What we do know is it was manufactured by Michel Hublot, production starting in 1954 and running until 1969. The company had been taken over by Katsunave in 1964, and production had been moved to their production facility in Berlin. Katsunave did make an attempt to revive the company name in 1970, but production would ultimately finish in 1972. Early machines used a 2-stroke engine built by the company La Valette, although the later post-1970 machines all used Franco-Marini engines. Of course, these were also 2-stroke 50s. Paloma's most sporty model of 510 was available as a calf racer, but also as a cross model, that being a very popular style of machine at the time. The overall design was fairly conventional, but it did boast a very large petrol tank and of course clip-on handlebars, and even 5 speeds, which came in handy of course, because that little Marini engine needed to work very hard to get the best out of it. But Marini's engine could make reasonable power, and you could argue too much power given the rather mediocre brakes fitted to the machine at the time. And again, whilst they don't command the rather high prices of their more glamorous opposition, they are nevertheless rather rare machines, and finding one of their sporty models could be very difficult indeed. But some would tell you they're worth the bother, just for the styling and rarity alone. Gitane Testa. Whilst her name may make English schoolboys giggle, Testa was a very serious player in the motorcycle industry, and they were built in fact in Bologna, just down the road from the Ducati factory, from 1949. They're also built in France, and that's where the Gitane name comes in. The machines are also marketed in Sweden as standard, and in Germany the Horrocks name was revived. The machines used Sachs engines from the start, and would later use Franco Marini engines also. The Champion was Testa's sporty offering for the 1970s, and was fairly typical of the breed, and I think is a very nice looking machine. It's low and sleek and very narrow, and has very well proportioned lines. The tank is long and offers a very long reach to the handlebars. This is fairly typical for racers of the 1960s. And the chassis looks every inch the racer too. It's extremely rigid and would offer great cornering ability, I have no doubt. The Marini engine is of course used here again, as in most machines produced in Europe at that time, well, the sporty ones at least, and does offer very good performance. It has a reputation of course for fragility, but while it is working, it is pretty darn fast. The Bologna factory is one of the first to really offer bikes with a character. In the 50s, mopeds really were powered bicycles, and they looked it too. But Testa offered machines that looked like proper motorcycles, with a very purposeful attitude, either as off-road or on-road race bikes. And the Champion really epitomises this philosophy. It has a 6-speed gearbox, Marini engine, and of course very racy styling. Later models would have fiberglass bodywork too, and the brakes were powerful too, particularly in the later models where a disc front brake was used. Of course, all this glamour came at a price, and perhaps not surprisingly the Testa was rather more expensive than its Japanese competition. Not surprisingly, Testa did race the bikes with some success, and this really added to the kudos of ownership, if of course you could afford one. And therein lay the problem for the Testa. This was a low production, fairly expensive machine, so it was never going to compete with the Japanese opposition. The company did limp on into the 1980s, but would eventually fade away and pass into history. The machines now are quite rare, production numbers being quite low at the time, and of course little bikes like this tend to get thrashed to death and thrown away like so many others. But if you do manage to find one, you're unlikely to encounter a more glamorous and sporty little moped. Moto Bikaner. Moto Bikaner is extremely French. In fact, the name even means motorbike in French. Moto Bikaner would introduce their first motorcycle in 1923, a 175 single-cylinder two-stroke. By the 1930s, they were France's largest manufacturer of motorcycles. Although the company would produce a range of four-stroke machines during the 1930s, they are perhaps best remembered for their small capacity two-strokes of the post-war era. During the 70s, like so many others, they began to struggle in the wake of the Japanese onslaught. However, they still managed to produce a range of 125 twin-cylinder two-strokes and 350 and 500 three-cylinder two-strokes also, in addition of course to their smaller capacity mopeds. Also in the 70s, the company would go Grand Prix racing and would score a number of victories in the 125 class. However, in 1981 the company would file for bankruptcy. The factory was bought out by Yamaha, who continued to produce motorcycles there. These were effectively rebadged Yamaha designs, predominantly scooters. Yamaha would shorten the company name to MBK. However, in the 2000s, Yamaha would make the decision they would use the plant to produce Yamaha badge machines only, and the MBK name was allowed to die. Although most of Moto Bikaner's moped range would be fairly modest, they did produce some more sporty models, the SPs, in particular the SP93. The machine would first appear in the 1960s and would feature a fairly large tank in a more conventional motorbike position, doing away with the conventional step-through design. The styling is predictably avant-garde with its square headlamp, square clocks, chrome fuel tank and very squared off overall design. But I think overall this design does work rather well, and is very in keeping with the design of many larger machines of the 1970s. But neat styling job apart, this is a fairly conventional Moto Bikaner really. The engine and running gear are shared with pretty much the rest of the range. So it isn't really any quicker, or better handling, or better brakes. But it is an all-round competent and reliable machine. So this is very much a conventional 60s and 70s moped with an extra little bit of style. Etom. As the name suggests, the little Etom or Etom, whichever, is very much an Italian designed and built motorcycle. The company really made its name in 50cc racing during the 1950s and 60s. The 50cc class had been very much cooked up by British guys who needed to do some racing but couldn't afford a big bike. So they used things like Norman nippies and modified them and went racing. Things got rather more serious though when Italian companies like Etom turned up with far more advanced machines, moving the game on completely and of course making it rather more expensive and rather more professional. As an interesting footnote, the first lady ever to compete at the TT did so on an Etom. These potent little machines were available in road trim, with a lights, horn and all. But of course the bikes are always eye-wateringly expensive, being a hand-built jewel of an Italian race machine. But in the UK in fact, you could buy a 650 twin for around the same money as the price of the little Etom 50. During the 70s and 80s, Etom would present an updated and modernised version of their range. But of course these machines were always extremely expensive, so it would be very unlikely you're ever going to see one of these. Well, outside of a racetrack at least. But these are fabulous little bikes, great styling and wonderful chassis and engines. Hope you enjoyed that collection of 5 super 70s mopeds. What other quirky collections of bikes would you like to hear about? Drop us a line below and let us know what you think. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.